So in the past, I've shown you a couple of examples of what happens when you don't invest in the UX, what happens when you don't look at the human factors, at the UX psychology, at all those different elements when it comes to people interacting with your products or services. You know, we had an example of failed product launches. We had an example of a massive kickback and a cost associated with a human error which happened because of, poor product experience. And what I'm talking about is the city fiasco, where 3 people lost almost $1 billion. And all of that was done with a satirical note, of course. But today I want to talk a little bit more on a somber note, because it's going to be about the cases when not investing in UX actually results in a life or death situations. And really what sparked the origin of this video, those ideas, was this book excerpt I received from one of the viewers a few weeks ago, Where Men Win Glory. And a short basic premise of that book is that a lot of deaths in war situations, in Afghan war and or other wars around it, are caused by a friendly fire. But the excerpt I received actually hits the note on the human errors, what happens when you don't really invest in UX when you design solutions.
The latter accident occurred during a desperate firefight between the Taliban and American Special Forces. An inexperienced Air Force tactical air controller had just calculated the coordinates of an enemy fighting position and was about to call in an airstrike when the batteries died in his precision GPS device, causing its display screen to go dark. Frantically, the air controller put new batteries into the GPS. The numbers flashed back on the screen a moment later, and he directed the B-52 flying overhead to drop its lethal payload on these coordinates. The air controller was unaware, however, that after a battery replacement, his GPS automatically defaulted to display the coordinates of its own position. He mistakenly called in these coordinates instead of the Taliban's position.
And besides the book itself, there also has been coverage from actual media publications. For example, Times Magazine covered it as well.
On December 5th, 2001, 2 months after the U.S. invasion, a massive 2,000-pound bomb killed 3 U.S. Special Forces north of Kandahar. The GPS-guided weapon struck the Americans because the controller on the ground, who called in the airstrike, changed the battery on his GPS device in the middle of the bombing run. But he didn't realize that once the unit rebooted, the aim point it began transmitting to the B-52 bomber far above wasn't the enemy's location, it was his.
And what threw me off here, the blame was given to the user, to the actual person who used that device, even if that device was not designed properly. For example, in the first one, you said inexperienced controller, right? Inexperienced operative. And in the second one, the journalist almost hints at it that the actual controller didn't realize. And that language alone kind of threw me off, because they're almost stating that, hey, it's a user error, it's not actual experience error or a product or a service error. One of those examples is also 3 Mile Island accident of a nuclear meltdown, which happened in the late 70s in Pennsylvania, US.
Frank, it was an accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, which is located on an island in the Susquehanna River, 10 miles from Harrisburg.
Officials say some 50 to 60,000 gallons of radioactive water escaped into the reactor building, and that the radioactivity penetrated the plant's walls. This is what reactor number 2's control room looked like last September when it was still undergoing testing. But the company's statements have not answered several important questions.
And if you even would jump, let's say, in the actual Wikipedia article, it basically states that mechanical failures are compounded by initial failure of plant operators to recognize the situation as a loss of coolant accident due to inadequate training, 1. Second, and human factors, as human-computer interaction design oversights relating to ambiguous control room indicators in the power plant's user interface. This is a mouthful, right? But it's almost attributing the poor UX, which wasn't considering of a proper training, proper, consideration of the human factors, the perception of the actual control instruments. And on a very high level, what happened really was that the light which indicated if the valve was on or off was partially open and the users couldn't tell, and that oversight led to partial meltdown. And Don Norman, the UX grandfather, also said about this accident that the control room and computer interface at the 3 Mile Island could have not been more confusing if they had tried. And there's a lot of, knock-on effects here and there, which caused a lot of cancer cases. There has been a lot of dismissal of that because it's not statistically, adequate. But of course, there is a massive ripple effect, which, if not detected on time, or even if not remediated properly, could cause even bigger, massive outbreaks. What happened, let's say, in Europe with Chernobyl accident. And additionally, another quote which hits the nail on its head is that pinning the blame on a person may be a comfortable way to proceed, but why was this system ever designed so that a single act by a single person could cause calamity? Worse, blaming the person without fixing the root, underlying cause does not fix the problem. The same error is likely to be repeated by someone else. But ultimately what he's saying is that it doesn't almost matter. These issues would be repeated by someone else. These errors would be repeated by someone else if you not properly address it, if you don't get to the root of it, if you don't understand what your users face day to day, what sort of issues they might encounter, and consider all the different edge cases. Like the edge case of the GPS device of that operative, who didn't know that if you reset your device, if it gets stuck, let's say, that it would lock in on your coordinates. And you can just imagine in a stressful situation, where it's the life or death scenario, you might just immediately, automatically say proceed, even if you haven't double checked those information bits. And what would happen is life or death situation. What happened, let's say, with the operatives where 3 people died because of that. Is it a human error? No, it's an experience design error. And alongside the actual 3 Mile Island accident, I also got an example from a Discord community members. Quick plug, if you haven't joined yet the community, make sure to join that. The link is down below. And the third example is about the Apollo 1 mission and an unfortunate disaster which changed how the spaceship design is approached. And when I say spaceship design, it's everything from the training, from the actual, people aspects, from the processes, from the actual instruments, all the different bits which have to be addressed in the modern type of technology, especially in this very heavily calculated but very risky business like space exploration. And it's a horrible case as well as the other ones. Astronauts actually died on a launch pad because of the fire. And of course there is a lot of variables in this, right? So there was flammable materials like Velcro, as well as the heavy oxygen environment, like it was fully oxygenated. And as you know, flammable materials and oxygen are the key components to fires. And after that disaster, they reduced the oxygen amount, they reduced the flammable materials, but the most important bit here was the fire safety for the people. Because while people don't blame here the humans or don't attribute this to a human errors, when the investigation took place, they basically discovered that astronauts just didn't know how to open the hatch. There was no prior training. The hatch opened inwards instead of outwards, so that, it's very hard for someone who's actually in the capsule to open the doors, especially in extreme situations where, let's say, something caught fire. And this is a massive factor in UX. You need to onboard your users, you need to train them, you need to consider what sort of features they're going to be using and to what extent, how does that's going to integrate, is it clear to them, can they perceive it well, can you change behaviors or create new behaviors through repetition. And that's exactly what they implemented. NASA engineers and astronauts started to train themselves in these critical situations, simulates different scenarios. They also had to redesign the actual hatch itself so it would be easier to open, would be much safer to open if needed be in emergencies. This almost caused the governing body, the business, NASA, to reflect what's right, what's wrong, and kind of reflect exactly what we need to do to avoid these massive losses where it comes to life and death situations. Anyone who's actually engaging with the users and bringing that insight to shape the solutions, to understand all the unhappy paths as much as the happy paths, is actually a decision maker when it comes to these knock-on effects which could cause life or death situations. It's as much about the cost and saving the cost for businesses and trying to anticipate all the different issues in terms of finances or failed product launches and things of that nature. If you are designing something which might be used in a certain scenario or in a certain stressful situations, you need to consider it. And I think that's where the UX comes so much in hand. But you know that already. And if you like this video, you find it informative, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so, bell notification and all the different jazz. Let me know your opinion down in the comments. And on that note, I'll see you next time.